I had a bit of, brilliant, thank you. Yeah, sort of a lot of questions I've been thinking about, in the context of my postdoc as well, and sort of the things that emerged through my PhD. So I've been quite interested in that, and I had sort of mixed feelings about it, because it was this article that I found super interesting, but also like, I've been on a lot of this, so it's more. So my work is kind of more about Wales, and maybe we can bring that in a little bit. I know we have some people here from Wales who might have good insights on that. This particular one is on Scotland, so maybe for Mila and Miriam, for you, this might be a bit of a new context. So, but hopefully interesting as well. So yeah, Scotland obviously has its own, status as a minority nation and a very active, and they are politically quite successful nationalist movement that hopes to turn Scotland into an independent nation state at one point, and how that plays in with kind of debates about migration. So yeah, maybe a couple of things I found interesting, and then we can maybe kind of just start a debate and see what people found interesting about it. Yeah, so I think for me, the most interesting element of that article, and something I've been thinking about since a while, was this idea of Scottish distinctiveness, but vis-a-vis the concept of migration, right? So theoretically speaking, it's kind of not news. You have Butler, and even from Hegel onwards, you have that the identity formation, specifically national identity formation, always needs the other, someone against whom identity is constructed. And that's not directly new in migration studies either. What I find interesting about this context, and I've kind of been thinking about this in a while, that usually, and migration studies has been on that usually the other is the migrant, right? The foreigner who arrives at the gates. National identity formation has been conceptualized so far as this, this is the nation state as a home, as a closed entity, and people from the outside is the unknown, the other, against whom an identity is constructed, right? But what is interesting here, sort of thing, that it's not quite clear who the other is, and it comes out in several elements. So that it seems to be in this kind of narration the SNP employs to Scottish distinctiveness as a welcoming nation towards migrants, that the other is not directly the migrant here, but the British sovereign nation state, or the English. There's different categories here floating around, which I found interesting, but it's the UK that is the other, against whom an identity is constructed, and less the migrants. I think for me, I think maybe we can discuss that. I'm like, that opens a bit. I think there's definitely shortcomings, ambiguities, but also potentialities to that, politically speaking, right? For people of migrant and non-migrant background. I think that's what I'm kind of found fascinating. So maybe to start, like, two things, even straight at the beginning of the article, and then maybe I open it up what people thought, is even the first sentence is kind of, how do states present themselves as inclusive towards migrants and their citizens? And I found it fascinating that it starts with that question, because how is a very practical question, right? For me, it was more why. Like, why do some states present themselves as inclusive? Why do some governments do that? Because not everyone does that. Compare the approach of the SNP as a nationalist party compared to the Tory government in the UK under Priti Patel, the hostile environment. This is like wildly different framings and approaches, or other nation states. So I think for me, it's a little bit, so why do some states use this kind of inclusive language? What's the goal there? They could easily use national identity formation by othering the migrant as well, or through hostile discourse. So what makes Scotland special? Yet using the Scottish example. And yeah, what kind of identity making is at play? So yeah, is it specifically that it's something about minority nations where that emerges? And there's a range of other things, but I don't want to kind of capture this too much. So what did you guys thought? What did you find interesting? What were kind of questions you thought popped up when you read the piece? Did you like the article? Did you hate it? Just anything is good. Sarah, do you want to start?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to read it at this particular moment, because Wales has just voted to reject the Nationality and Borders Bill, and now Scotland has as well. So it's, again, they're sort of distinguishing themselves, as you say, from the Westminster, you know, the hostile environment policies. So I thought it was an interesting time to be reading it.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I found interesting was that the you know, the young people that were interviewed had this sort of contradiction of having experienced hostility, but were keen to not be very critical, because they went with this discourse of welcome that was being promoted by you know, the political kind of discourse.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of an article I read, which I'll try and find and share in the chat, of about Wales and racism, and somebody, I can't remember his name, interviewed some young people, migrants who'd experienced racism, who really played it down because they didn't want to offend the host country.
Yeah.
So that seemed to sort of chime a bit with this article as well.
Yeah.
That was my feelings.
Yeah, definitely. Let me get back to some of that, because I had some ideas there as well. Definitely that this was a dynamic. Wondering if that is in maybe sovereign nation states as well. Would that be the same if you would have interviewed people in England? So something like this, maybe to sort of. What do other people think? Miriam, what did you thought? It would be interesting to hear from someone who's not from the UK what you thought about this.
Yeah, and for instance, from Quebec, so there's kind of a lot of similarities here, but no, but particularly on that point, I like it strikes me too, like this kind of I don't know, two sides in the interviewee's speech, but like for me it was kind of a methodological issue here, because like there's still a power relation that isn't addressed in that paper, like between the migrants and the researcher. And there is that, I feel like when I do field work and I'm doing interview with migrants, like there is that good migrant tropes that are played out like inside the interview, and so it isn't surprising that you can feel like there is some like xenophobic experience and all these things, but at the same time, like there is a kind of that trope that is played out. So I was like, it would have been interesting just to do a participative observation, like where these migrants are, and just to like taking part in more casual conversation, like outside in proper interview. Just maybe we could have another side of the story. So just a quick point, but for me it was, and maybe not the better methodology to get into that topic. Okay,
yeah, I think that's a absolutely fair point. I think there's other ambiguities about this whole discourse kind of for the young people as well, how they were sort of, and I think something that is worked out in the article, this idea of that this is almost a conduct of contact, a governmentality. It's kind of expected of you to ponder this kind of narrative that the SNP wants to see of Scotland. And people play its part, but I'm interested. So like, yeah, for me, maybe we can get back to that later. I was like, is this potentially also something that could be a form of counter contact, so to speak? I thought of it in the UK context. It's almost like, yeah, you can, politically speaking, can create challenges to an asylum regime of the sovereign nation state of the UK that is incredibly, as hostile as it can basically get. So is this necessarily all problematic, or is there some potentialities here?
I thought actually the article could have been a bit longer. Actually, it felt like it was actually very easy to read. It wasn't at all painful, and I thought that one of the things it said at the start was that it would be interviewing different two politicians, I think. Yeah. But there was only maybe one quote which actually got used, which I thought was a bit kind of disappointing. But I thought, it's the thing I mostly thought about really was just the whole sort of political setup between Scotland and, let's say, England. And there is a bigger history than just the whole Brexit thing. Scotland has been welcoming asylum seekers for 20 years before the independence referendum and before the leaving the EU referendum as well. And it kind of talked about that a little bit, but as I worked for a while on asylum and refugee services in Wales in 2000 and can't remember, like 2004, 2005, and it was we always looked at Scotland as being really good at actually encouraging people to go there, and explicitly the message was we're kind of losing population and we really need young people to come and live here. And they were definitely seen as being much more progressive than any other part of the UK. And that was the foundation before, lots of the quotes from Nicola Sturgeon seem to be having a dig at England, having a dig at Brexit, but there's more weight to it. There's more depth to it than just that. And I can see how she's kind of maybe politically leveraging that scenario to remind Scottish voters, look, we're not like the English, we are internationalist and we are nice people. Yeah. But yeah, I think also I agree in terms of methodology. It could have been good if it'd been maybe a bit more ethnographic in a way. And I think maybe I like the way that a lot of the quotes are in kind of Glasgow sort of patois, and the way that like I was spelled AH, was it AH rather than I? Yeah. And but to have got more of a feel for how Glasgow is would have been quite good, because it's a real place. It's very it's got some very testing neighborhoods to live in, and to actually live in Glasgow and certainly people through the dispersal program, people were living on the very edges of the city as well. They were living in some of the really difficult housing estates and the tower blocks and stuff like that. So to be welcomed there is a pretty big achievement. Yeah.
That's no, absolutely. I think that's. I think I'd agree with you so far. I thought almost found the conceptual points in the article they kind of hit on are more interesting or like better worked out. I think so as well. It has methodological shortcomings, and the kind of way it works with the empirics could have been definitely better. But absolutely, how you said, that could be the element of Glasgow. There's been this really interesting example. I don't know if you've heard of it, a couple of months ago when there was an attempted deportation of 2 people in Glasgow, and basically the whole neighborhood turned up and prevented it, and literally not just activists, like people from the streets sort of thing. And it was interesting how then the day later the SNP kind of jumped on the bandwagon, so to speak, and made it all about how this shows that Scotland and Glasgow is a bit. But there was also, it was like people used it as either Glasgow is friendly or Scotland is friendly, or it was a real interesting example of this kind of identity formation of like, in Glasgow we don't do that, or in Scotland we don't do that. But yeah, absolutely, I think that this could have been kind of brought in there as well. Do people have other thoughts, interesting ideas? Maybe Jamie or Beth, you guys are as well both from Wales, and there's obviously a kind of a not directly the exactly same context, but a similar context, I would say, sort of the evolution and existing nationalist movement. Did you have any ideas on that, maybe, or about the article in general? Yeah, Jamie.
Yeah, I think like there was quite a lot of parallels between Scotland and Wales, and like particularly with the way like outwardly Scotland's promoting themselves as like very inclusive and very international, but then even in the article, like I noted down, it said they're a nation state in the making, which I thought was really interesting, because that kind of signifies like a really dynamic and like fluid sense of maybe Scottishness and belonging. But then in terms of the actual interviews with the young people, it's like what was coming back was that old-fashioned, like the tropes, like Miriam was saying, like they're experiencing the racism and their lived experiences, but then that's completely at odds with what like the Scottish government are actually promoting about the nation. And I think it's really similar in Wales as well, like just from personal experience of like working with young migrants in Wales, like I would say it's quite similar, and particularly with the good like immigrant kind of, you know, mentality as well of downplaying experiences, you know, and showing positive contributions, like you need to get back all the time. So those were some things that I found interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I thought maybe for everyone that would be something that I found interesting, and I think maybe I kind of arrived at some answers they're trying to give, but it's a bit like exactly the point you're making, and that came through a couple of times, that there is a bit of a divergence. I think it's on page 3, that according at least to some surveys and so on, sort of non-civic and exclusive criteria like birthplace, and so on, or like are quite strong sort of for the public, still quite strong determinants of what Scottishness is. And you still have, obviously, you know, like in any other, you know, white majority country, you have an embedded racism and so on. But that's, so what I found interesting and where I'm not fully, okay, so why, so at least from the survey data, how they presented it, is that more than 50% of the Scottish population actually thinks there's too much migration and sort of holds views that are not too dissimilar, maybe in a lesser extent to England or so on, but kind of not too that far away, right? So that Scotland, at least according to that, is not this like liberal, open, welcoming paradise according to that. So what I found interesting, okay, so why, and it's probably in Wales not that different. I mean, Wales voted for Brexit after all, right? Or the people, at least. Wales is always, we have to be careful when we talk of these things. But so yeah, what do you guys think? So why is that in Wales and in Scotland you have this divergence between a discourse of the politicians or the government and kind of public perceptions? Because my feeling is, like, at least crudely put, in England it's almost the other way around. There you have politicians actively driving a really, really hostile discourse, and there is probably a lot of those attitudes, yes, embedded in the population, but I have always the feeling probably the government drives a more hostile discourse than the population, generally speaking, would embed. And while almost with Scotland and Wales is almost a bit the other way around. When you have Welsh and Scottish politicians, they're like really keen on presenting these nations as this kind of welcoming. So what is that? What's the rationale there? Why doing that if a big part of your population actually thinks differently, right?
I think it's because the SNP is just still doing very well, and you know, if you look at sort of even sort of like 2000 and before 2010, most of the MPs in Scotland were actually the Labour Party. They weren't SNP, and so, you know, the SNP have just been on this. They've replaced the Labour Party as the main party of Scotland, and people aren't bored of them yet. And people are prepared to listen to Nicola Sturgeon, and voila, I think that's it really. I think it's just that they still have that kind of, people are prepared to be led by politicians more so than they are in England, where, I mean, we're in Wales as well, we're probably more, you know, I think people are still happy with the Labour Party and still voting for the Labour Party, whereas in England, you know, there was the Tories have been taken over at least once, maybe twice in the last 5 years, and the whole Brexit thing was maybe about rejecting leadership from politicians, and that's kind of what I think.
Okay, Miriam?
Yeah, but like to stay in a Foucauldian perspective, I think that it's also just a matter of having a big enough population to govern. And then it's mentioned, like, and in Quebec, in Canada, it's the same problem. Like, we have a negative birth rate, so we do need immigration, and even more when you are in an independent sovereign. There's a word in English to it, but when you want to achieve independence, like, you need to have a weight to go forward with that idea. There is also all the academic perspective, we need migrants just for economic purposes to fill some kind of jobs, and we need highly skilled people and everything. But there is a really, maybe it could be of interest, but there is a really interesting documentary that has been filmed after the second referendum in Quebec, where it's 2 hours long. It's way too much long, but you can watch just the bits and pieces at the end where you have actual migrants, like second generation, first generation people who are there, and you have both sides of the story. People who want just to go away from Quebec because they feel they are facing racism and they don't want to be left alone, and that they want to be part of Canada. And there is a big backlash, immigration backlash after the referendum because of these, and then these speeches. And then you have other second generation, third generation, or really strong independent seekers, people who totally agreed with the Parti Québécois. And so I think that maybe the rationale is to get these people on board, right? People who feel economic purposes, and then at the same time have these Scotland independency idea in mind, that can just participate if there is a referendum. I'm not really aware of well aware of what is going on with referendum and everything in Scotland, but from my perspective, it could be
How close was it last time?
Sorry.
How close was the referendum last time for you?
Oh, it was for 49-51.
Wow. Okay.
That was pretty good. Yeah, my dad was crying. Yeah, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I agree with you there, and I think it comes through more on the example of EU migrants. So it would be interesting how that works with asylum and kind of other elements there. But I think on page 7, as sort of talking about how, and I found that was a really interesting, and that's where this kind of idea of ambiguity comes in. What is the potential there? Where it says it's on page 7 after the quote of Sturgeon in that. This was also her acknowledgement that EU migrants could have agency in Scottish politics. Through this interpretation, she infers, as quoted below, that it is Scotland that values diversity and inclusiveness, whereas England does not. So there's always this kind of politics of distinction. We are more welcoming sort of thing. But then the next one is interesting. The statement becomes a means through which to consolidate EU migrants in Scotland as possible future supporters of Scottish independence. And I think this is probably kind of conceptually speaking, I found the most interesting part of the article, because it was that kind of explains this SNP drive. Even so, if why do you have this discourse of politicians driving that if it's not with the population necessarily a super popular thing? And I think this is this idea of Scotland. And then I was like, okay, what is it? So in Scotland, is it per se about minority nations, I think they call it? So would this be always that's why it's interesting, your Quebec example I find really interesting. Or is it always do you need basically a minority nation with a strong nationalist movement that also drives independence kind of thing? So it would be interesting to see how that discourse works in, I know, for example, that Wales has, there's a very similar situation. I think in Catalonia as well. I think that the kind of nationalist parties there are generally speaking quite open on the more left-leaning. So there seems to be a really interesting similarity between those movements and how they relate to migration. And sort of for me, it was okay, so this idea of independence supporters, right? In the article, it comes through that, the SNP really kind of, that it's almost a form of governmentality of conduct. It's expected, and that young adult migrants took that up in saying oh, well, even though I experience racism, I'm gonna still pretend this is this kind of welcoming country and so on. So this is obviously highly ambiguous and problematic, but is there potentially also kind of, is there an interesting potentiality here, as a role, almost an empowerment for people to say how you said this example would be really interesting actually to see maybe first, second generation migrants who are kind of supporting independence because of that, maybe because it's, it gives a sense of inclusivity that you would maybe not get in the sovereign host nation. I don't know. What do people think? maybe I don't know if this was just something that sort of came to me working, but yeah, because I think it mentions briefly somewhere that there is a kind of I think the SNP has an organization called New Scots or something like this specifically, so where there's specifically people organized of migrant background who support Scottish independence. So yeah, there is this kind of interesting element to it. Yeah. But that was just something that came to me. Is there anything else people thought, Sarah?
I was just came to me, it'd be interesting to see what young migrants in England, if you interviewed them, whether they would have that sort of double bind thing as well of or whether because well, we don't, whether it really or isn't more hostile in England, whether there's still that drive to play down racism and to, you know, I can't imagine, I know this is just purely, you know, my imagination, migrants in England sort of really identifying as English. I can't imagine that, but then I don't know, because, you know, I don't know if there's any studies on it, but it'd be interesting to find out whether they would do the same, or whether because the discourse, the political discourse is different, that they would do something different. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. Would be a good comparison. Is there anything else sort of people thought about the piece, or anything we haven't discussed yet, what you thought was interesting, or kind of that tickled your mind a bit? Miriam, were you trying to say something? Or? Oh, okay. Well, then I'll jump in. I think something I found kind of as a additional thing, yeah, I think we had this sort of thing that, you know, this narrative of distinctiveness of Scottish, that I think on page 4 it aims to bolster nationalism and steer that conduct of conduct. So we had this idea of building a Scottish identity. But what I found even more fascinating, in addition to this, like, you know, kind of, okay, this of future independence supporters, was kind of on page 9, I think. Yeah, so we're sort of talking about, yeah, the concept of the other. Identity formation always needs an other, but then it's based specifically of, there's a study of this, Pakistani Muslims in Scotland, and Hussein and Miller found that this ethnic group, quote, adopts Scottish identity, Scottish attitude, Scottish nationalism, and even some degree of Anglophobia as tools of integration. I found that super fascinating. So this idea, and then next sentence, Anglophobia therefore can play a role in the integration strategies of migrant communities in Scotland. So this idea that, yeah, every kind of national identity formation needs an other, but again, the other is here not the arriving migrant, but the sovereign nation state or the majority nation. And I'm wondering if that actually has, I could imagine, again, this is in my imagination, and of course, you know, I'm luckily not subjected to, you know, generally speaking, any kind of xenophobia or racism or anything like that, but that for arriving people, this has some sort of appeal, because suddenly you're not the other, someone else is the other, so to speak, right? And it's also that the other here is not the kind of, you know, actually, you know, the arriving migrant who's usually through all sorts of politics excluded, you know, from a range of things, or oppressed in a sociological sense. But the other is here, you know, but again, there's a very, who's the other? Is that, you know, are we talking England or the English or the UK as a nation state? But I found it easier. The other there is, yeah, you know, it's kind of whatever this discourse makes it to be, and it could actually be a discourse that kind of associates that otherness with history of colonialism, the British Empire, and our histories of exclusion and racism and so on. So I don't know if, you know, we always see this like othering as necessarily a bad thing. Like, you know, as soon as people hear that, it's like, oh, sure, you know, the other, this is automatically an xenophobic, exclusionary dynamic of politics. But I don't know, I've been reading a lot of Chantal Mouffe lately, and her concept of agonistic politics is very much that you need an other. Any kind of politics needs a kind of, you know, contrast to what you stand in. This is kind of what drives politics fundamentally. So yeah, I found that really interesting that that apparently for this particular group of people, Anglophobia was a way of integrating, so to speak. So to say, yeah, we identify as Scottish because we're not English, you know.
That's kind of that is quite easy though, isn't it? That's definitely pushing on an open door.
Yeah.
I did actually think about something just now. There's a comedy on Radio 4, on BBC Radio 4 called Fags, Mags and Bags. It's about like an Indian family who run a corner shop in Scotland, and it's a bit annoying sometimes, but it's also quite funny. And they had an episode the other day when which was actually directly sort of confronted racism and people being racist. So I think I'll put it in the link. It's an acquired taste, but there definitely is you know, that there is a history of people who went to Scotland from India and Pakistan for definite. But this article is about something a bit newer, isn't it? It's like a different, rather than, this is essentially about refugees and people who claim asylum, rather than people who came in the 60s or the 70s.
All right.
But I don't know, there's also kind of like Scotland has got a certain sense of humor as well, which and it is, I think it's correct that this article's mostly centered on Glasgow, isn't it?
Yeah, I think they done most of the fieldwork there, from what I understand.
You know, I mean, for example, it's easy to sort of say England is this, England is that, but then, you know, you have bigger cities like London, which is an entirely different world. And I mean, as far as I remember, the asylum program meant people went to lots and lots of different places across the UK. So Manchester, a lot of people went to Manchester as well, and maybe Liverpool in quite big numbers too, and Birmingham. So it'd be interesting to, like, I think maybe the article's a bit it's only got 8,000 words, but it maybe if it had been able to reference some other cities in other parts of the UK of maybe a similar size to see how they had dealt with similar things.
That would be super. Actually, weirdly enough, I think, or I know there is a project going on right now between University of Manchester and University of St Andrews, who does fieldwork about kind of housing and the experiences of like asylum seekers in Manchester and in Glasgow. So the whole Glasgow focus in Scotland, I mean, here in this case, I don't think they focused on asylum seekers per se, but there is an interesting element there. So you know, you have in the UK the dispersal policy, like asylum seekers are dispersed to cities. So the devolved nations actually have no control of who's coming, sort of, so to speak. But the only dispersal area in Scotland for asylum seekers is actually Glasgow. So while in Wales, for example, you have like Swansea, Cardiff, Wrexham, Newport, and in England, it's different cities as well. In Scotland, it's literally just Glasgow. So literally every single asylum seeker who gets sent to Scotland is sent to Glasgow. That's just legally speaking, you know, how it works. So most of the research actually is kind of done there and very Glasgow centric, so to speak, not just through that. But that was just, Miriam, you wanted to say something earlier about that.
Yeah, just to come back to the concept of other, I came across, but I didn't dig too much into that, but the work of Elk Winter recently, and instead of having a binary perspective between us and other, she's like trying to break it down into three, like with us, them, and other, or us more than other and others. And I think it's really useful. Sorry?
No, I just said, wow, that's interesting, because I've been thinking about that. What's her name?
Elk, ELKKE, Winter.
Winter.
Yeah.
I need to look that up. That sounds super interesting.
Yeah, she has a lot of she's working a lot on that way of just, she's talking about skilled migrant, I think in Australia or something like that. Or no, she's in the, okay, I didn't think that much. I just used the concept for another, but I think it's kind of productive to try to go beyond like the binary us and others, and then because even if there is another other, like these migrants are still not totally us, right? Like they are still like in an in-between position, and that's where more than other or them is really useful, because they still, like, I think it's really reflecting what we are seeing in the article, like when migrants do speak about like that in between, like maybe yes, it is fitting like the rationale of the party just to like sorry, my English is bad today. Just to conduct their conduct the way the party wants, but also maybe it's just like a sense of in-betweenness, like an uncertainty. Then you can really read into that, because yes, there is another other, but they still don't totally belong.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really a great way of thinking of, because I thought that exactly. I was like, yeah, so this, maybe going back to what I mentioned before, the Anglophobia element of like, this is a way of integrating, of saying like, at least we are not the other, so to speak, but you're still, this is I've been working on that in my PhD actually, and that at the end, there's somewhere like, they're not like the other, like in a binary sense, when you have these discourses, let's say, of a British government or, French, a comparatively coherent sovereign nation state. But there you are, there's an interesting element of us and them, or the binary doesn't quite fit. That's a sense it's interesting that you mentioned that, because exactly that was kind of a lot of my notes were about. This doesn't really fit explanatory wise. It doesn't feel that it feels there is another element to this here in this particular example. What I thought about Scotland specifically was kind of, and it's also this whole concept, or this whole on page 9, the whole first part, it's a little bit unclear there as well, because it talks about this Anglophobia element constructed on the premise that I'm Scottish because I'm not English. Thus, the comparison with England and the English appears to carry a significant weight in Scottish identity construction. But then it says to understand how young migrants in Scotland, that is the other, strive to relate their identity to conform with, and so on and so on. So suddenly there the article kind of says again, okay, Scottish migrants are still the other, sort of, who's, through all sorts of exclusions, racism, and so on. So that's what I meant was at the beginning. I was like, who's the other here? Or maybe there's different levels of othering, so to speak. So to see it more as an activity, like a constant identity construction, and nothing that is kind of that binary, basically. Great. Thanks for bringing that in. I've got definitely some new reading now to do. What else do people have any other thoughts or anything we kind of haven't come across yet? So I'm trying to think. So we had the nationalist element, and maybe sort of at the end, I thought the kind of ramifications, I think at the very end in the conclusion, it mentions kind of ramifications for other minority nations. I thought that was quite interesting. So, we said at the beginning, this is an interesting moment of reading that article. I basically chose it. So Angharad sent it to me. Some of the people from Swansea might know her because she reviewed the article. And it only came out. So again, in this reading group, we're obviously trying to read stuff that's relatively new. So this came out when it came out. Just last year, basically. How Sarah had mentioned, the Welsh government and the Scottish government both have rejected. It's not that you can do much about it, but it's symbolically quite powerful that they both rejected a kind of big groundbreaking new piece of legislation, the Nationalities and Borders Bill, which will massively again, tighten rules and create an even more hostile environment in the UK for asylum seekers. And so it's kind of the current context maybe. So it leaves us with a couple of interesting thoughts here, that article, on like identity formation. Is like where will this go basically in the near future? Yeah, that's maybe something we haven't even talked about yet. It mentioned it's very briefly, but Brexit, really, that's kind of something, it's an elephant in the room. We haven't really, that hasn't come through so much. So what do people think about the kind of, more current context? What do you see in sort of Wales and Scotland? Maybe where do you see that going? Yeah, sorry.
Can I just ask you, because you probably know, I don't quite understand, you might be able to explain the fact that there's this big, quite big hype about Wales and Scotland rejecting it, but I understand that is sort of more symbolic than anything else. Do they have does it go anywhere, that? I mean, does it get taken anywhere, or is it, because I heard there was something about it was seen as sort of interfering with Welsh devolved, it would sort of go against, that they could sort of get at it from saying that it interfered with Wales as a devolved nation or something. I just wondered if you could explain a bit, because you probably know.
Yeah, I do know, but I'd be happy to. Maybe first, were there others who wanted to say something on that? Yeah, well, there have been sort of, through my own work throughout the PhD, I've worked with a lot of people here in Swansea and in kind of Wales, and there have been since a while sort of always people have thought, okay, how can we basically challenge UK policy on a Welsh level? And in terms of the big migration policy, that's de facto impossible because it's not devolved, right? So, but yeah, there have been attempts, slowly but steadily, kind of in the political sphere in Wales and in Scotland as well, to see that you can challenge it by saying, so basically in the UK, we obviously have a devolved system that, certain things are decided by the devolved governments, and usually that considers sort of, so migration is completely sitting in Westminster, but so the hostile environment idea, right, is that you make, by definition, the environment for asylum seekers hostile. And for that, you need to cut their access to services, right? Like health and medical aid, housing, Those things are usually devolved. So if you can legally make an argument that a piece of migration policy basically contradicts with something that one of the devolved governments decides, then you kind of potentially have a case of saying this could be fought in a court of law, in a court of law. So yeah, there have been sort of attempts of sort of saying that, but generally speaking, the Nationalities and Borders Bill, no, yeah, they can't prevent it from being voted through investments. So it's not, yeah, migration has never been in that sense devolved, but yeah, there's sort of elements, for example, on housing or access to the NHS and things like this, where, and I think the argument in the Welsh Assembly was that a lot of it goes against the kind of well-being and future generations and things like this. So yeah, people are kind of trying to, the one way you can effectively challenge sovereign asylum policies is by saying this goes against something we have technically control over, and so you can't do that. I don't know of a particular example where this has been sort of successful yet, but there's definitely kind of there's ways people have, at least in Wales, started really thinking about that and how it could be used in the future as a kind of challenge, so to speak. Alan?
I mean, there's not much that Wales and Scotland can really do when it comes to asylum policy, but they can certainly make a difference when it comes to how refugees live. And like Jamie put down, yeah, that there is things like housing and access to kind of jobs and other things. Definitely something the Welsh government has supported. I don't know so much about Scotland, but yeah, I mean, when you're actually claiming asylum, I know a lot of people who have claimed asylum, and it's quite hard to see the end of the process, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's and that's largely down to central and you know, it's been like that for a long time. I guess it's getting worse as well with the current government. But yeah, was going to say yeah, so in a way it's actually quite brave that Scotland and Wales have made their own decisions, and like I said at the start, it's not just about Brexit. It happened, things started a long time before that, and but maybe it's something which Wales and Scotland can use as an example to show that they are maybe more inclusive and more progressive, because obviously more people in Scotland voted to remain than did in Wales.
Yeah.
But the argument could still be won in Wales, I think.
Yeah. I think it mentions it briefly on the article on page 6 that, yeah, Scotland as a country does not have a right to determine its immigration policy. In Scotland, migration policy is therefore discursively governed, and any legislation in effect has to align with UK government. Ultimately, across the UK, local authorities, there are differences in terms of some integration measures directed to migrants. So this is nothing. So apparently it's more about the local actually. So how supportive, that doesn't even have to be necessarily like a Welsh or Scottish thing. It's more down to local authorities. But I think the importance more here is like, yeah, it cannot be a real challenge. I think we're really talking more about a discursive element here. I think that shouldn't be maybe underestimated of kind of the message that sends. I think I'm genuinely convinced that the kind of really like the Brexit vote and certain attitudes, and this is a long process. This doesn't come overnight, but you know, we had effectively, and even under New Labour, you had these really hostile framings of this has been going on in this country since 30 years effectively, of every single day there's attitudes being, you know, across the press being peddled of how migrants are an enemy other arriving at our doors. And at one point this becomes so ingrained that people really, really believe it. So I think it makes a difference. You know, even I have to say, like, what comes out from this article is what I mean is with ambiguity. For a large part, the SNP does it for political reasons. It's kind of, I don't know, for me it was a bit, it's kind of national identity formation on the back of migrants still. We're still, you know, the other to a certain extent, how Miriam pointed out. But it's still, I don't know, my feeling is this is still better than, you know, like the hostile environment and the thing Priti Patel's put us out on a daily basis. So, but yeah, I think we're definitely more on the element of discourse here, and I think that's what a lot of the article is about, identity formation. It's kind of, yeah, I think there's definitely limitations to what the governments can actually do to be more welcoming. Which maybe as a last point, I don't know what people thought about this. That's something I was like, I worked a bit in my PhD and I was like, well, because this is all about identity formation, this is also quite easy for Scottish politicians or nationalist politicians to say, because they don't have a sovereign, and here the emphasis is on sovereign nation state to rule yet. Let's say Scotland becomes independent, right? It's an island nation to the north, so not really easily accessible. But you know, if it wants to follow, like, you know, or like Wales hypothetically, you know, the concept of a territorial nation state, I think it's incredibly unlikely that it would practice a completely open border policy. So it's kind of easy to be saying you're welcoming if you don't have to, you know, in the end, categorize who comes in, who comes out. Yeah, maybe that's kind of, I don't know, what do people think about that? Is that maybe, I don't know, if something came to me, I was like, yeah, sure, it's more interesting to see what happens after independence, so to speak, in terms of migration, because, yeah, I mean, you can say all you want before, but once you have, yeah, because they're not responsive, so in a weird way they can be welcome because they don't have control, like they do not have to do border control, so to speak. So Miriam?
Yeah, but I think it's interesting because in Quebec we have provincial, I mean, Quebec is a specific case in Canada. Like he controls immigration, but the other provinces doesn't. But he does. I mean, he controls numbers and quotas because of the French immigration that Quebec still want to have enough people, French speaker coming in. And so that's what I was thinking about when I was reading the article. But I think it really depends on, because there is a lot of independent parties in Quebec. Like lots of parties want to do the independence, but maybe more far right or lefties, and they have total different approach. And right now we have like a party that is keen to independence, but doesn't. It's not really on the table anymore because it was missed. But they have really like more far right, and not far right for Canada, so it's not that much far right, but and regarding immigration, they are really I mean, there is a lot of like systemic racism going on, and like a lot of cutoff on migration quotas and everything, but at the same time they do have these rational independence and everything, and if you have, like, for example, like more lefty parties on place, like what I'm trying to say, sorry, it's not clear, but I think it really depends on the position of the party, like immigration, and it doesn't really, like, because we do have a lot of power regarding immigration, and
okay,
it plays out differently regarding like even if the independence haven't happened yet. So I mean, take what you get from what I'm trying to say.
No, that is quite a fascinating point. This is, again, maybe as a question to the Welsh speakers in the group, or not, I don't mean in Welsh language, but like the Welsh who are from Wales, who know maybe the political landscape, like Sarah or Beth or Jamie or Alet. Hey, Keith is in for the last 2 minutes. Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that it depends on the party, because something I found fascinating when I started reading it, I was like, okay, so it's all about getting future independent supporters, so to speak. So for the example of the SNP, this makes a lot of sense. But I was like, I found the Welsh context fascinating, because the Welsh government kind of does a similar thing with this whole nation of sanctuary and welcoming approach. But this is Welsh Labour. They're unionist, right? They do not actually want independence for Wales. So yeah, I found that sort of fascinating, but I'm not a big, this is something I'm only starting to kind of do a little bit of research on, is like Plaid Cymru has a really open approach to, and kind of, welcoming approach to asylum as well, so sort of like the SNP. But here in Wales, the Welsh Labour has actually kind of adopted that as well, even though they're not after Welsh independence, really. So
it goes back further than that, though. It's about, how Wales is just a more inherently sort of socialist place, and how people in Wales have, had a different set of politics to England, I suppose. I don't think this is really about how open Wales is to independence. I think it's, and like I said half an hour ago, up until 2010, there were lots of Labour MPs in Scotland rather than lots of SNP MPs. If ever the Labour Party was going to form a government at Westminster, it needed its Scottish. A lot of amazing Labour politicians came from Scotland 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's being that. Yeah, maybe it's just being a bit more socialist that is the foundation of why Wales is interested, and the kind of the social inclusion agenda that Welsh government have pursued right from the start as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's true. Like, we keep forgetting, because it's that the whole SNP dominance in Scotland is a relatively recent phenomenon. Till 2010, they were, not, Labour ruled Scotland, so to speak. So this is a comparatively new, thing as well. So yeah, that could potentially play in there as well. Hi, Keith. I know.
I don't believe it. I was just reading the paper.
Yeah. Well,
I went home specially to do this.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a 4 p.m. start. But maybe as a last thing, would you kind of we have obviously debated it since an hour, so I don't want to keep it for ages. But what did you thought maybe as a last thing? What did you thought about the paper? So what did you kind of find interesting?
I liked it. It was quite good. I think it's an important area to do research in. Don't think it was very well written in many places. It was more a series of statements than I couldn't follow the argument some of the time. But I mean, I thought it was, I think it's a very interesting and important point. But of course, to me, it's very much about Scotland trying to make its own difference from England and running with that, which is, of course, what the SNP do big time. So you can see that they really go for the sort of inclusive Scotland narrative, which I think I'd be more cynical about. I think Scotland's such a better place for ethnic minorities than anywhere else. But
yeah, it's definitely kind of one of the core things I think sort of debated over the last hour. This idea of Scottish distinctiveness, but how it's more, definitely. I think we can all agree that there have been some sort of methodological shortcomings in the article and kind of written in the way. Let's see, something is lost in the chat. I
think it was important that they interviewed the refugees, etc., themselves, and they did pull out experiences of racism and stuff in Scotland. So, and I think that was very important. And I think the way they show that they can't they don't make too much fuss about that, because they're seeing otherwise it's sort of challenging the whole sort of meta narrative of the country. It would be very problematic to do that, actually, like you're causing trouble basically all the time. That would just reinforce in many ways the sort of prejudice attitudes and things that may be there anyway. So so you can only
definitely there's something we came across as well, that there's certainly a range of ambiguities here for the people as well. And I think they kind of thematize this with this idea of conduct, a way of governing migrants, so to speak. National identity formation vis-a-vis this kind of notion of distinctiveness. Thanks, Jamie, for what you put in the chat. I think that is quite spot on for the kind of Brexit context. So I think that's something for at least what we ended up as kind of a last thing, and maybe I don't want to keep everyone else too long, so maybe as a last thing, kind of the kind of more recent Brexit context. And as for me, it's sort of, I brought that up more. It's like easy for Scotland to kind of construct themselves as this welcoming nation, considering they're not sovereign. So hypothetically, if they would be independent or after Brexit, would they actually still drive a welcoming migration policy? It's also, how do you define that? I mean,
it's a very good point.
Is welcoming open borders, or we have a range from completely open borders all the way to the hostile environment in the UK right now, and there's probably variations where it would in between be. But sort of after Brexit as well. What would Scotland then actually do if it's independent?
We might find out soon, I expect. Going here.
Potentially.
Don't say I blame them at all.
Yeah, but I mean, they're already like really emphasizing the economic importance of these migrants. So I think they will just go further in that, like skilled migrant will come and other ones can just stay. Like they have to participate, right? So if you burden, you don't come, and if you can like participate and just like compensate for the negative birth rate, that's fine, but keep your problem home. So I mean, that's my 2 cents about it, but who knows?
Just say one bit of research I would like to see is someone analysing England, to see how England both nominally tries to recognise and accept migrants, but also at the same time the counter narrative, the counter discourse of, well, Theresa May's government or Priti Patel or whatever, basically tend to keep out and clear off, sort of thing. They can actually sort of formally accept all these international legal issues, and then there's a sort of hidden sub narrative which is basically saying no.
Absolutely. No, definitely, and this will obviously continue further with with the new nationality in borders bill. So it'd be interesting to see how that kind of continues.
Yeah.
All right, this was really great and interesting. Thanks everyone for participating. Yeah, is there any kind of last things people would, like something you really, really want to get out there before we wrap up? Okay, brilliant. No, thanks everyone for coming. This was quite insightful. And I think, yeah, again, like we have 2 more reading groups to go till our conference at the 24th and 25th of May, which I'm really looking forward to. If you're coming and participating. Yeah, so we've got 2 more reading groups, and again, like the last reading groups, if there's something you think it might be really interesting for the group and in terms of migration studies that you would really like to read, please forward it to me and Mila, and then we can put it on for the next group and can potentially read it. So we've got obviously 1 more now in March and in April, and then in May we've got the conference going. So yeah, please feel free to forward us anything, and we'll send another invitation email then for the next reading group in a month or so.
Yeah. I'd just like to say that I think it's a good paper to have talked about. I think it was, yeah.
Okay.
That's just right sort of style, and I mean not style, the balance of the empirical and conceptual, and it wasn't too long, didn't drag on like that. I thought so too, and it was relatively recent, so it only came out last year, and the idea. Yeah, I think of the group for Mila and me kind of setting it up was like the reread stuff that's relatively recent, basically. Yeah, cool.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming.
Anyhow.
And yeah, you'll get an invitation email to the next group after that.
Yeah, I'll get the time right next time.
Yes.
I just look at the email again. It's a 5 p.m. for France, I think. I just must have noticed
exactly.
that.
Yeah, no,
I don't know.
Maybe I should take that out. That was originally at the beginning when we set up the group so that the French people won't get confused. And I kind of just kept copying and pasting that in. But yeah, no, it's 4 p.m. our time.
Day back from the strike today, so there's been so many things to try and fiddle around with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cheers.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks.
It's nice to see everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
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 I just have a question, Mila and Franz, and Aled, if you want to stay.
No, it's okay. I'm going. I'm just trying to find how to say goodbye.
It's just for the conference.